In March 2025, something happened that no financial model had formally predicted. The United States Treasury market, the deepest, most liquid, most institutionally trusted debt market on Earth, began selling off at the same moment the dollar was weakening. Normally, those two things move in opposite directions. When fear rises, money flows into treasuries. Yields fall. The dollar strengthens. That is the pattern the entire post-war financial architecture was built around. This time, both fell together. Analysts at the time used careful language: repositioning, volatility, technical adjustment. But underneath the careful language was a more uncomfortable observation. Something in the foundational logic of how global capital seeks safety was shifting. The assets that had functioned as crisis anchors for 80 years were behaving differently, and the assets moving in the opposite direction, upward, steadily, without interruption, were the ones that required no government's continued credibility to hold their value. The question that followed was not new. It was ancient. When the system you trusted can no longer be trusted, what actually holds? That question has been answered repeatedly across every geopolitical rupture in recorded history. Not by theorists, by the people who lived through the ruptures and came out the other side holding something functional. Their answers, accumulated across centuries, point to 4 structural categories, not the most obvious ones, not the most discussed ones, the ones that actually kept working when the institutional layer of the economy stopped working around them. This video examines those 4 categories through both the current geopolitical environment and the historical pattern running beneath it. Not predictions, not investment advice, only documented structural behavior. What survives crisis and why? To follow this clearly, understand what geopolitical crisis actually does to an asset's function. It dismantles 3 conditions simultaneously. Institutional trust, the confidence that banks and governments honor stated obligations. Monetary reliability, the belief that a currency holds stable exchange value. Jurisdictional security, the assurance that property rights remain enforceable. An asset requiring all 3 to function loses that function the moment anyone fractures. An asset requiring none of the 3 retains its function, regardless of how severely the surrounding system degrades. The 4 categories that follow are positioned in that second group, not by design, by nature. The first is physical gold held outside institutional custody. In February 2022, Western governments froze $300 billion in Russian central bank foreign reserves over a single weekend. Assets held in dollars and euros inside Western financial institutions became inaccessible through a coordinated legal mechanism that required no military action and no market movement to execute. Every government watching drew an immediate conclusion. Assets held inside another system are only as secure as the political relationship with that system's operators. The behavioral response was measurable and swift. Central banks globally bought more than 1,000 tons of gold in each of 2022, 2023, and 2024, 3 consecutive years at a pace double the prior decade's average. By 2025, gold had set 53 new all-time price records in a single year. The institutions buying most aggressively were not chasing returns. They were repositioning toward an asset whose function required no counterparty's continued cooperation to maintain. Physical gold held outside the banking system carries a structural characteristic. No digital instrument replicates. Its value transfers completely in a single exchange, requires no network to be online, no institution to remain solvent, and no jurisdiction to remain stable. It crossed every border in the historical record. It is crossing them now, when the institutional layer becomes a geopolitical instrument, which 2022 demonstrated it could become, rapidly and without warning. The asset that exists entirely outside that layer occupies a structurally different position from everything inside it. That position has held across every disruption in the historical record. It held again. The second is productive land in politically stable jurisdictions. This category requires a precision that most treatments omit. Not all land survives geopolitical crisis. Land inside the disrupted system absorbs capital controls, currency collapse, and potential confiscation. The survival characteristic belongs specifically to productive land, agricultural, income generating in jurisdictions stable relative to the surrounding disruption. The current geopolitical fragmentation makes this distinction more significant than at any point in recent decades. As the world's financial flows increasingly reorganize along geopolitical lines, with investment redirecting away from adversarial systems and toward trusted blocs, the productive assets positioned, Outside those flows retain a structural independence that financially integrated assets cannot replicate. A functioning farm in a stable jurisdiction continues generating output measured in harvests, not in currency units. It doesn't respond to sanctions. It doesn't respond to capital controls. It doesn't respond to the freezing of foreign reserves or the weaponization of payment networks. The soil produces because the soil produces, across every documented geopolitical disruption. From the 30 Years' War through both world wars, through the regional currency crises of the 1990s and 2000s, productive land in stable jurisdictions generated ongoing value when paper claims in disrupted ones had lost most of theirs, not because land is magical, because its function is real, physical, and independent of the institutional architecture that crisis dismantles. The current environment is accelerating jurisdictional distinction. Where land sits, relative to the fractures forming in the global system, is becoming a more consequential question than it has been in generations. The third is embedded transferable skill. No government can freeze a skill. No sanctions regime can confiscate productive knowledge embedded in practice. No capital control restricts the movement of capability carried inside a human being. This makes embedded transferable skill the only asset on this list structurally immune to confiscation, not because it is hidden, but because it cannot be separated from the person who holds it. Turkey's currency crisis of 2021 and 2022 demonstrated this in real time, as the lira lost more than half its value in savings denominated in Turkish currency, evaporated in purchasing power. The professionals who rebuilt fastest, developers, engineers, medical specialists, skilled craftspeople, did so by deploying knowledge that generated internationally denominated income, regardless of what the domestic monetary system was doing. Their skill produced value in currencies that held. The crisis reached their savings. It could not reach what they knew. In Sri Lanka's 2022 collapse, where foreign reserves fell below $2 billion and the currency lost over 80% of its value, the same pattern emerged. Embedded productive capacity transferred across the crisis. Paper savings did not. The geopolitical environment accelerating now, fragmenting trade networks, restructuring supply chains, redirecting capital flows along political lines, creates increasing demand for skills that produce across multiple systems. The more fragmented the world becomes, the more valuable the capacity to generate output that multiple systems need simultaneously. The fourth is trusted relationships operating across multiple systems. When formal institutional infrastructure fails, when payment networks become geopolitical tools, when correspondent banking relationships are severed by sanctions, when currencies lose exchange value, commerce doesn't stop. It reorganizes. It migrates from institutional infrastructure into the informal architecture of established trust. This has been documented across every period of institutional breakdown in recorded history. The medieval merchant networks that maintained long-distance trade across competing political systems did so through personal reputation and relationship rather than formal institutional guarantees. When one political system became hostile, the network rerouted through relationships and another. The trust was distributed. No single disruption could sever it entirely. The same logic applies now. In a fragmenting world where SWIFT has been demonstrated as a sanctions weapon, where correspondent banking relationships are increasingly political, and where the digital payment architecture itself is splitting into competing geopolitical blocks, the commercial relationships that continue functioning across those fractures, built slowly through repeated exchange and demonstrated reliability before the crisis created the need, are infrastructure, not digital, not centralized, distributed across human networks that no single political mechanism can address simultaneously. The fractures forming now are creating exactly the environment where those networks have historically proven most valuable. 4 categories. Across ancient history and current events, across Weimar Germany, 2022 Russia, 2025 gold markets, and the fragmenting payment systems of the present moment. Physical gold outside institutional custody. Productive land in stable jurisdictions. Embedded transferable skill. Trusted cross-system relationships. What connects them is not their form. It is their structural independence from the 3 conditions: institutional trust, monetary reliability, jurisdictional security, that geopolitical crisis systematically removes. The world's central banks read the 2022 signal clearly. They responded by buying gold at historically unprecedented rates into 2024 and 2025, not because they predicted specific events, because the structural logic of what holds when institutional systems become geopolitical instruments had become visible in real time, at scale, without any theoretical abstraction remaining between the lesson and its observers. That logic is not new. It has simply become harder to miss.